Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 242, Theories in Research and Personality. Today we're going to go over Chapter 3, where we talk about Freud and his theories regarding psychoanalysis, how we apply those, and how we assess those as well. A couple things to quickly note. Make sure you're keeping up with the materials. Make sure you are watching this video as well as reading before class. That's the material on the quiz that is due before our class session. Additionally, if you have any other questions, you can always email me or stop by my office hours. Happy to chat. And if you can't make office hours and would like to meet, just shoot me an email and we can find a time. But in terms of what we're talking about today, we are first going to start off with learning a little bit about Freud and his understanding and discovery of the unconscious. We'll talk about his theory of personality, which I think will take up the majority of this chapter, but we'll also talk about the application that he did with this theory of personality, which he called psychoanalysis. We will talk about the projective tests that are used to assess this, as well as finish up with some strengths and criticisms of his theories. One thing to note is that of the people we talk about, many of them you might find some interesting things that you think are useful. Some of them, some stuff that's probably not so useful, and I do encourage you to take all of what we talk about in kind of a way that you can holistically create your own theory of personality by the end of it. But to start off this class, let's talk about one of the most influential people in all of psychology and all of history, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was born on the 6th of May in 1856, and he lived, I forget the exact date, but all the way until, I believe it was the 1930s. He was born in modern-day Czech Republic, which is now, which was then Austria, so he was an Austrian citizen by birth. However, those lines have changed since then. He joined the Vienna, I believe it was the Vienna University when he was 17 years old, and there he studied medicine, and specifically he was focused on brain anatomy and neurology. And a couple of the things that he worked on after graduating with his MD in 1881 was he actually spent a lot of time studying the biology of nervous tissue in animals. And he actually, they claim that he provided a lot of information that led to the subsequent discovery of a neuron. So actually a very influential person beyond psychoanalysis and kind of one of the cogs in the machine that has got us to where we are today in terms of understanding neurons even. After he graduated, he entered private practice, specializing in nervous disorders in 1886 after spending a couple of years jumping between labs. And this is where we get into Freud really understanding this idea of the unconscious and making his own theories. And the first thing he did was work with a guy called Breuer. And with Breuer, he and Breuer together published studies in hysteria. And they talk about a woman named Anna O. And Anna O, they used hypnosis to treat her hysteria. And what they mean by hysteria is that they claim that she had a bunch of different symptoms, including paralysis of her left arm, hallucinations, and they claim the ability to only speak in other languages, although she spoke German supposedly only. Later on, examination of neurological details suggested that she actually suffered from probably some type of complex partial seizures exacerbated by drug dependence, which she was an avid drug user. Some people claim that these are very similar to seizures in the frontal lobe. However, we aren't sure. But what Freud and Breuer did was they talked to Anna O using hypnosis and just kind of speaking to her about what she was experiencing. And one of the things they used was called free association. And free association, what we mean by that, is a description of the hidden material by patients that seems to relate to the causes and cure of these hysterical symptoms. And that's how Freud described it. They came up with the term chimney sweeping, or the talking cure, which was the free association. So really putting this person under hypnosis, having them trust you, and beginning to just talk, right? What are the things that you, that come to mind when I say certain things, or what is it about your childhood that springs to mind? And Freud came up with this theory that these early traumatic sexual experiences, in the case of Anna O and many other people he saw, were what was responsible for these hysterical symptoms. So claiming that early sexual trauma or early sexual experiences are what are causing hysteria in these older adults. And so during this era in the 1890s and early 1900s, Freud created the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, of which here are a couple members, which was formed by Freud and his followers. In the front row, from left to right, we have Sigmund Freud right here. We have G. Stanley Hall, and somebody we will talk about in a couple weeks here, Carl Jung. A lot of the followers of psychoanalysis that we do talk about today originally started in the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society before maybe leaving Freud because his theories are something else. So Freud has discovered this unconscious, this idea that there are conflicts going on between people. And the first way he described this was this idea of a topographic model. And the topographic model is the idea that our personality might be divided into different levels that we are aware of. The first of which we call consciousness, right? This idea of the thoughts that we are currently aware of. Hopefully what you're aware of right now is whatever I'm saying, the Freudian theory of psychoanalysis, all of that kind of stuff. But we also have other types of conscious. He claimed we had a pre-conscious. And so pre-conscious was any material we can retrieve. I like to think of this as what we now call memory or long-term memories. It's anything that you might remember. So, what is my name? What school you go to? Right? How many continents there are? Your favorite movie? Anything that you can pull that you know. Right, can come to consciousness, but it's not necessarily in your consciousness because you're not thinking about it right now. And lastly, we can talk about the unconscious, or thoughts that cannot easily be brought into awareness. So these are things that modern day we might call non-consciousness, or Freud would say that these are the thoughts or kind of repressed feelings, memories, etc., that we can't just access freely, except under maybe extreme situations like hypnosis or other things. So one picture of this model, I think, looks similar to probably models of Freud's theory you've seen, but this is the first iteration. Right? The topographical model of this is the first iteration, where we have the conscious level of awareness, which are our thoughts and our perceptions. We have memories and stored knowledge in our what we have here called a subconscious, but we often think about as a preconscious. And then we have our unconscious. And here is where Freud said we keep things like our violent motives, unacceptable sexual desires, any shameful experiences or immoral urges or fears, things that he would claim, right, are being held away from us to keep us sane or to keep us okay. Right, we're trying to hide away that so we can live a normal life. And Freud talks a lot about this kind of conflict we might have. So this topographical model was nice at first, but he decided to change it up and still use some of the similar things. But he called this the structural model. And the structural model is much more what we know today, right? Dividing this personality into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. And he still used the topographical model with this, right? He used this levels of consciousness, preconsciousness, and unconsciousness right here. However, he focused more on the fact that each one of these personality subsets, the id, ego, and superego, all perform various different actions. And for at least the ego and superego, they're available at all levels of consciousness. Freud claimed that the id did not live in the consciousness at all. One way you can think about this is more or less that the id might be considered a devil on your shoulder and the superego an angel on your other. And you're kind of in the middle with your ego. So we see a lot of different models often looking at like an iceberg-like situation, in the sense that, right, as we know, the tip of the iceberg example means the fact that there's a lot more underneath the surface. So Freud claimed that there's a lot more going on underneath our conscious awareness. And even our preconscious, right, is stuff we can get to down here, but it's maybe not everything. So the ego, he claimed, is something that takes up a lot of conscious and preconscious space, maybe some unconscious. The superego takes up all three and is kind of runs very deep, but the id is something that's hidden away. And the id is what we're going to first talk about, because Freud claimed the id was the personality structure at birth. The id is considered the devil on your shoulder. Right? And Freud called this the innermost core of personality. This is what we are born with. And he claimed that this was completely within the unconscious mind. So, as children, Freud claimed that we were pretty much fully developed in our personality by the time we hit, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 6 and puberty, rather than our personality continuing to grow. So he believed that the id that came at birth, when we are still existing and maybe conscious at that point, we can argue about that. He claimed that this was what was controlling us, this kind of id force, and our actions were based on 2 things, the pleasure principle and wish fulfillment. And with the pleasure principle, it's the idea that the id seeks out immediate gratification and release, right? It seeks out pleasure. It ignores the rational considerations and environmental realities of the situation. It does what it wants. With a baby, that makes a lot of sense. It cries when it's hungry. Right? It poops when it needs to. If it's not feeling good, it will complain until it does. So the id, right, down here might want things like going to parties. The id might want sex when we're adults. The id might want, to be aggressive and punch the guy, you don't like. The id is considered very hedonistic. It wants pleasure without consequences. It doesn't care about forethought. It doesn't consider other people. It's very much me, 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 me all the time. We also have this idea of wish fulfillment, right? We know the id can't get everything it wants all the time, but we need to satisfy our unmet needs somehow. So sometimes Freud argued that we use other means in which to get our wish fulfillment, whether that be daydreaming or generally ideas like dreams. So you could imagine, somebody who wants to, lose weight, they might just dream about that as kind of a sense of wish fulfillment in order for that to happen. So that is the id. And after about 2 years of living with purely an id, Freud claimed that the ego started to form. And the ego is a personality structure that we would consider most like kind of you. I know that's weird to put it, but if we have an angel and a devil, this is the one who's kind of in between. Now, the ego can move between consciousness, pre-consciousness, and unconsciousness, right? That's great because where our id is only non-conscious, or unconscious, however you want to call it, our ego is something that we can bring to the surface and focus on. So one thing that the ego does is it satisfies the id's impulses. Again, if you think of the id like a crying child, right? It says, I want this, or I guess a grumpy kid, or I can't think of quite the word I want to use here. Generally, somebody who's a grumpy kid who really wants food and they're bossy. So, we as adults, our ego in that situation, it says, okay, well, we can give you what we can, but we can't eat candy for dinner every night, right? And then the id might complain because the ego recognizes that there is this idea of a reality principle, or the ability for the mind to assess what the situation actually is. What is the reality here? And then acting upon it accordingly. Is it okay to, use the bathroom right now? If you're in class, probably not, The ego might say, hey, we need to do that another time, We don't solely act on pleasure. And the major thing about the ego is that it's going to decide when and how the id can satisfy its needs at this point. However, the ego gets another role after the superego is created. So the superego is a personality structure formed by, give or take, around 5 years old. And this is the angel on our other shoulder. Interestingly enough, Freud said that this construct moves freely throughout all levels of consciousness. So recognize that Freud was born in the Victorian times, where things were considered, like showing your ankles more or less was considered scandalous. And he claimed that the ego represented society's values and standards. So what maybe your parents or what you're growing up with, the place you're socialized, what they are expecting of you. So if you live in a sexually repressed culture such as Victorian England, you might end up dealing with some of these issues we can talk about in a bit. And so what's interesting, though, is the powerful superego, which is, again, a very powerful part of us, can actually lead us to what he claimed was moral anxiety or ever-present feelings of shame and guilt. And why do we feel this way? Freud claimed it was because we had these unrealistic expectations. The ego was setting us up for failure. The ego wants you to be perfect all the time. It doesn't want you to think about sex. It doesn't want you to be uncouth. It wants you to be the perfect person all the time. That's impossible. We know that's impossible, right? You have to, eat, you have to sleep, you have to do things. But if you are failing to meet those impossible standards, and he claims you have a very active superego, it might be like somebody nagging at you all the time and wear you down. So those are the three major components, right? We have our id, we have our ego, and we have our superego. Recognizing that the id is having this role where it has to balance between the ego and the superego and the, I may have said that wrong. The ego has a problem of balancing between the id and the superego in figuring out what is okay to do, right? When is it okay to do these certain things? When is it not okay to do these other things? Because your superego is going to say, well, it's never okay to do these. But recognizing you got to let off some steam at some point. So all of this comes back to that idea that our ego is us in the middle of our angel and devil on our shoulders. However, this wasn't the only thing Freud talked about. Freud talked about, and I'm Triebe? I didn't take German. I don't really know the pronunciation. But these were what he called strong internal forces that motivate behaviors. These were our motivations. What motivated us, right, to do things? And he claimed that there were, these drives or instincts are what allowed us to operate with our id, our ego, and our superego. And the categories of instincts he talks about, the first one we still hear used in a slightly different way, libido. And libido is life, or also thought of as a sexual instinct. And how Freud determined, using terminology, claimed this was that it was a natural energy source that fuels the mechanisms of the mind. So almost like something that is going to be the reason for doing things is this life urge or sexual urge. He also claimed Thanatos, not that guy, but not necessarily a terrible example. Thanatos was a death or aggressive instinct, right? So the opposite of the life instinct. And Freud claimed that we had part of our desire was to utterly destroy ourselves by living only with the id, or possibly hurting ourselves. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So he claimed that most human behavior, Freud that is, was attributed to the libido. And the libido includes actions aimed at receiving pleasure. Now, he also talks about, the Thanatos is the death instinct, which is turned outward and expressed as aggression against others. So this wish to die, though, remains unconscious, he claimed. However, if I look at any Gen Z millennial humor at this point, I totally disagree with that. But understanding that these forces were also what helped control or cause the id, the ego, and the superego to operate. So these drives of sexual pleasure, or these drives of living and having receiving pleasure, or these drives of being aggressive and expressing hatred towards yourself at one point, this wish to die must be a self-hatred. He also claimed that this desire to die was to just return to the earth, that this is all some kind of energy force. psychological energy, he claimed. Yeah, so what do we think about this? Well, we'll spend some time talking about that in class, but recognizing that these two, this libido and this thanatos, whatever it might be, are going to make up some of the drives behind the id, ego, and superego. However, the ego's got a really tough job. Right? The ego needs to deal with all of these unwanted thoughts and desires to avoid anxiety. Because if one part of you is telling you, right, I want to just party, I want to, have sex, I want to just eat, I don't care about anybody else, I want what I want right now. And another part of you is saying, well, that's really wrong. Why do you feel that way? How terrible of you to feel that way. You should never step out of line. You should always, you shouldn't have any sexual urges, this, that, and the other. Well, we have to somehow get rid of all of that unwanted anxiety, all those terrible thoughts. And Freud came up with a number of what he called defense mechanisms to do so. And boy, howdy, are there a number of them. So let's go through these individually here. The first one is one that we have probably heard, repression. So repression, and here we have a picture of somebody reaching in to try to find some repressed memories, is the idea that repression is an active effort by the ego to push threatening material out of consciousness. Right? So this is the idea that if somebody, if somebody was coming up to you to tell you something and you just say, no, leave me alone. Right? If you, turn off your phone, for instance, after somebody trying to tell you this, that is what we might be talking about with repression. We are trying to get rid of these thoughts. The squish cat down here, I think, has a great example of this, right? Is that if you're using repression, you might just squish down your feelings. You might say, nope, I don't want to think about them. I'm going to walk away. Right? And you could do, theoretically destructive behavior, drinking, partying to get rid of your thoughts on drinking and partying or whatever those thoughts might be. He claimed that this required constant expenditure of energy because, it's going to take a lot of effort to keep those thoughts away because they should be eating at us. And that's what Freud claimed with repression. Another defense mechanism we talk about is sublimation. Sublimation is channeling these threatening or unconscious impulses into socially acceptable actions. You might be an angry person with a lot of thanatos, this destructive energy, and your id might be very active about being aggressive. So Freud said that some people are able to make this a productive defense mechanism in which that they take out whatever their aggression is on a target that works, or generally, it doesn't have to be aggression, but just generally these unconscious impulses into socially acceptable actions. So maybe, can't think of a good example other than an aggressive one, but you can imagine how maybe if Freud would claim you fell in love with somebody who wasn't your spouse. Maybe Freud would claim that you turn that attention that you love towards that person towards your spouse. And maybe you get your spouse flowers or you do things for them that you really wish you were doing for this other person. And Freud would claim you are being productive with this and you are using this tool correctly and you're able to defend against this issue. However, we can also talk about things like displacement, where we have a boss yelling at a person here who later decides to go yell at their family. So displacement is displacing impulses to other objects or non-threatening objects. So if you're getting yelled at, you might turn your attention towards somebody you can yell at and pass the buck along. Displaced impulses do not lead to social rewards, though, because otherwise we'd be talking about sublimation, Sublimation is productive and it's displacing these things, but it isn't taking them away. So recognizing, though, with displacement, a great example that's not very nice is that, if you are getting yelled at and you go home and you take it out on your dog, that is an example of displacement. It doesn't just have to be another person, If you go, vandalize something, again, that is going to be displacement, but you're not actually confronting what it is that upset you. Another defense mechanism we can talk about is denial, and all of these people are in denial river. However, that is not denial we are talking about. Denial is the refusal to accept that certain facts exist. Just that, right? Nope, doesn't happen, not true. You're right, incorrect. I'm going to put my head in the sand and not listen to you. This is an extreme form of defense, right? This is like the ultimate. If you just deny, right, what is going on around you, that's going to be a huge problem. I think about that "This Is Fine" meme where the dog is just sitting in the burning building. But this is going to actually make a person less realistic, right? So if you're somebody who is constantly denying things, right, you're possibly what Freud would consider losing your grip on reality and what reality is, right? But denial is a thing that happens, right? If you think about the 5 stages of grief, which may or may not be exactly correct, denial or right, not believing that something happens is maybe one way that we can cope with a problem. And at the most extreme, right, like pretending that, you see this sometimes, that pretending that a kid that passed maybe during childbirth didn't die, that's an extreme problem. That's not the only one we can talk about. We're still in the middle of this list. We can talk about reaction formation, which I think I like this picture, right, that somebody here is asking for money but says thanks but no thanks. The idea is that reaction formation is acting in a manner opposite to the threatening unconscious desires. So, right, this person wants money but is acting in the opposite, right, that they are saying they don't. And if any of you remember Hey Arnold, Helga Pataki is a great example. So if you've ever seen Hey Arnold, in the show, one of the things is that this girl, Helga Pataki, constantly beats up on the main character Arnold, and she calls him names, she treats him like garbage, but she has a shrine to him in her closet where she says how much she loves him, and just I think it's like, I wish we could be together. But she's doing the classic reaction formation where she has one thing that she wants and she says, absolutely not, I can't do that, so I will do the opposite. And it's kind of like overcompensating, possibly, is one way to think of this, but not exactly the same thing. So that's possibly helpful, but maybe not. Another one we can talk about is intellectualization, which I actually hadn't heard of this one before, and seems healthy to me, but maybe not. So intellectualization, Freud would claim, is this idea of removing all emotional content from the thought. So this helps bring difficult thoughts into consciousness without anxiety. So in the image here, right, this person heard that his grandmother expired, clearly an old comic, that their grandmother died. And so instead of being completely reasonably upset, we would say that this person tries to remove all emotional content of this thought and helps bring this difficult thought to something, okay, I can't make her come back, but I can do things to not feel bad about this. I can help out. That's good in some ways, but also bad in others. So I do walk the line with that. Another one we can talk about is very classic, the projection example. We still talk about this to this very day. Are people projecting their own thoughts about others? So in this example, which is really hard to find a good example online, the mom here is clearly not happy with who she is. And she continuously says, right, like, I dislike myself, I hate myself, I hate myself. And what she does is she actually projects that onto other people, right, saying like, oh, I hate my daughter. And a good example of this might be in terms of like somebody who's cheating on their significant other. So this is oftentimes how it's thought of, is that if you're cheating on your significant other, and you see this in TV and stuff, it's claimed that you're more likely to think your significant other is cheating back on you. Now, whether or not that's true, I don't know. But the idea behind it is that you're placing somebody else's, or your own guilt that you have for your cheating, in somebody else's, right? That they're also doing this. Because if they're doing it too, it's going to make you feel less bad. So this is attributing these unconscious impulses to other people. So my unconscious impulse to, right, in this example, cheat on my significant other, might be something I claim everybody has, and that actually you have it more than me. Because that's going to make me feel better. It's going to make me feel less bad. And this frees a person from the perception that they're the only one to hold this thought. So, that's a lot of defense mechanisms. So Freud thought all of these defense mechanisms were useful in defending our ego from either the id, the superego, or a combination of both of them. He argued that this was very important because if we have these two opposing forces constantly telling us what to do, it's going to be stressful for us. And so by repressing some of those thoughts, by putting them into useful ways, by displacing them onto other people or things, by just denying they exist, by pretending the opposite is true, by ignoring emotions, and by assuming everyone else does it too. These are all ways in which we can pass the buck off of ourselves and feel less bad. Now, it's up for debate if these exist or not. They're interesting ideas, but are they falsifiable? Something we'll talk about in class, so keep that in mind as well. But it's not all about the id, ego, and superego or the defense mechanisms. It's also about probably one of the weirdest things we can talk about in all of psychology, which is the psychosexual stages of development. So this was a sequence of development which was made up of stages characterized by these what Freud called erogenous zones and sexual desires. I would probably watch this lecture with headphones in if you got a roommate, because it just gets even weirder as we go. So he suggested that each stage has a specific influence on the adult personality. And he said that we can get fixated or stagnated on these different stages of psychic energy. Right? This is the libido kind of growing up. And if we get fixated on any one of these points, we might be stuck there and have some issues we carry into adulthood in terms of some baggage. So the psychosexual stages of development go from the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, what we call the latent stage, and finally end up in the genital stage. So let's go ahead and break down each one of these, starting with the oral stage. And so the oral stage is the claim that this happens in the first 18 months of life, and that there are various erogenous zones that matter to people here. And for kids, that is the mouth, the lips, and the tongue, things related to, oral stuff. But this makes a lot of sense if you think about why this would be the most important factor for people at this time, kids at this time. Because they really can't do anything else. And the most important things to them are their mouth, their lips, their tongue, things that are going to actually matter, right? This is what's going to feed them. This is what is what they're going to be able to express themselves as, is really just how they talk or cry, more or less. And that what happens, though, is that if feeding goes awry, whether you're fed, Freud would claim, too much or too little, this can result in a fixation and a development of an oral personality. And when we talk about oral fixations, what we mean is somebody who is stuck with this libido energy in this stage that never kind of made it past this stage. And one thing that they might feel, is the need to constantly have oral stimulation. So they might do it through things like smoking, eating or chewing objects, drinking alcohol. But there's other ways that Freud claims this happens in more of a mental way. Things like sarcasm, as I love sarcasm. Freud might claim I'm stuck in the oral phase. Now, Freud was famous for smoking cigars, and one of the most prominent quotes about Freud is regarding his obsession with cigars and smoking. And they said, "So are you stuck in the oral stage?" And Freud said, "Well, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar," which is kind of a bullshit answer if you ask me. But I mean, why does it work for everybody else and not you? But so the oral stage goes for about the first 18 months of life, where our erogenous zones, or zones of major pleasure, are going to be the mouth, lips, and tongue. But after that, we move on to the anal stage. And as Taro Gomi said, everyone poops. So with this, the erogenous zones, make sense, are the anal region. Now, why would that be a region here? Well, because children are being toilet trained. It is the time in their lives where they're beginning to understand that they might have to control their bladder, control their bodily functions. And what Freud called traumatic toilet training, which could be a number of things, could result in a fixation in a development of an anal personality. And what Freud claimed would cause trauma here was too much on one side of the spectrum. Were you engaged in toilet training too young, where you were forced to hold your bladder more frequently, in which case that might cause you to be stuck in an anal stage? But additionally, what if your parents took too long to potty train you and just you got used to existing, to be taken care of, in which he would claim is also a way you could get stuck in the anal stage. And he called these two different things anal retentive, which we hear a lot of, and anal expulsive personality types. And so with things like orderliness and stubbornness and a compulsion for control, anal retentive people are going to be people who are possibly trained too young and retentive or holding in. Makes sense why. These people might be very orderly. However, we can talk about anal expulsiveness, where somebody was potty trained too late, and maybe they're more stubborn would be the thing. They are less likely to go along with what other people say because they're used to getting things their way. They're used to being able to exist in whatever way they want in terms of down there as a kid. So the anal stage also hopefully makes some sense. However, you could imagine why this might be an issue when you're older, if you are stuck in the anal stage. We can also talk about the phallic stage, and for those of you who don't know what a phallus is, Freud claimed that men like to show off this a lot due to the types of buildings they build. A skyscraper is pretty much the easiest way to go vertical, but he claimed everything had a hidden meaning. So the phallic stage is from ages 3 to 6, and the erogenous zone is the penis or the clitoris. However, only one gender has a penis. A phallic object is a more or less penis-shaped object. And so there were different issues, Freud said, that boys and girls would have during this. So the first thing is that children develop a sexual attraction for their opposite sex parent during this time. And he called this for boys the Oedipus complex, the story of Oedipus Rex, in which Oedipus ended up not realizing it, marrying his mom after killing his dad, found out later. But Freud claimed this was an urge that children had to be incestuous with their parents. In that the reverse would be the Electra complex, again, another story from mythology, kind of more flipped the other way. A great picture of this is this little boy here, holding hands with his mom, wanting to be close to his mom, but kind of being angry at his dad because his dad is seen as a rival, Freud would claim, because his dad is the one with his mom, in the same way that, there's a goalie, so you can't score. Homeboy here is trying to mean mug the goalie, we would say. But during the phallic stage, boys develop what they call castration anxiety, and girls develop penis envy. So boys, theoretically, are afraid that if they try anything funny with mom, they might be castrated. They might lose their penis. Where girls during this time are, Freud would claim, likely to have at least seen that there are people who have other things, and maybe they are very envious of the fact that they don't have a penis. Freud claimed that basically everybody wanted a penis. I like this comic, of course you can't touch mine, you already broke yours off. Freud claimed that a young boy who saw a girl naked would claim that this person was already castrated, that they had been a boy before and they were castrated, and that's what happened. Now, eventually the children repress their desire for the opposite sex parent, usually by learning what that parent does and kind of following along with them, and hopefully moving on towards a better stage of development. But people stuck in the phallic fixation Freud would say, were considered reckless or resolute in what they did, very, very vain, right? Maybe thinking they're the best person and kind of playing fast and loose by the rules. Freud also claimed that this might be the root of homosexuality. And one thing about that I found really interesting in doing some readings is that Freud didn't think homosexuality was this terrible thing that many people did back in the day. He thought that this was just kind of a byproduct of being stuck in the phallic stage. And he said, it happens, right? It's not necessarily unnatural for it to happen, which is a very different perspective from a lot of people in 1900. Just a fun fact. So that is the phallic stage. So now we have moved through 6 years of age, at which point we have hopefully not gotten stuck sucking our thumb or other objects, have not become too anal retentive or anal expulsive, also known as anal relaxive. We hopefully have not developed any kind of phallic fixations. And at stage 6, we can, which goes from age 6 to puberty, we can relax. There's nothing big at this stage. Latency is we kind of our sexual urges, our libido goes underground. This is the ultimate in sexual repression, right? That these sexual desires abate, and boys and girls are uninterested in each other, right? Oftentimes, you can think about how this is played out in modern culture, right? Boys and girls are uninterested in each other, and every school had its understanding that because the opposite gender has cooties. At my school, I was always under the impression that girls had cooties, but I've been told that other school cultures claim that boys were the ones with cooties, but at my school, girls had cooties. So you know. But after puberty, we get to normal development. And so this is the genital stage. Congrats, we have now made the erogenous zone at puberty the genital area, which is where we end up with as adults. So theoretically, if you can get past your first 3 really stages, and you can make it to the latency stage without any fixations, you're probably going to grow up to be a normal person, Freud would claim. Maybe. I mean, there's a lot we can unpack in this lecture. So swiftly moving on away from the psychosexual stages of development, let's talk about how Freud got to the unconscious. Well, he claimed that these id impulses don't disappear when they're pushed out of consciousness, but they're expressed in an alternative form. And we talked about some of those alternative forms, maybe smoking if you have an oral fixation, right? Because you, Freud would claim, were not given enough feeding times as a child. And he thought that these altered forms of expression can be noticed by observing what he claimed were innocent behaviors. So, right, if I am sitting here and chewing on a pen in my mouth, he would claim, right, that is something I can notice and say that maybe you're stuck in that form, or that fixation, I should say. And so some techniques he used to get to unconscious material included dreams. So people would talk about their dreams, talk about that was weird, I'm sorry. Projective tests as well, which we'll spend some time talking about. So projecting your own unconscious thoughts onto what you see. And then free association, which we can also talk about as being a way to kind of get at these thoughts. We've already spent some time talking about that, though. The first one, though, is dreams. Freud wrote a lot on the interpretation of dreams. Right, he wrote a book on the interpretation of dreams, and dreams are something that psychologists still don't understand. Many of us have moved away from this belief that, right, the id impulses are going to be, right, giving our dreams what is happening. Most of us don't believe that anymore, but it is still there. Freud claimed that trained psychoanalysts can identify common dream symbols because, as Freud claimed, dreams were what he called the royal road to the unconscious. Very interesting here because how do we interpret these dreams? The book doesn't really go into a lot about it. While the book does talk about bunch of different symbols Freud talks about. We can spend some time in class talking about this, but there's a lot of different dreams that are actually recurring that we know different people have. For instance, some of you might have dreams where your teeth fall out. I used to have dreams that I was being chased. I never knew who or by what, but I was always being chased as a kid. Freud would claim that tells a lot about my unconscious mind there. Funny joke, a man goes to Freud and he says, doctor, I have a dream that I'm a pair of curtains. And Freud goes, pull yourself together, man. Swiftly moving on from that terrible joke. We can talk about projective tests as well, and these assess unconscious material by asking us to just take stimuli and respond to them. And I put all of them up here already. We've talked about ink blots a lot, so hey, look at this and what do you see? Right? We can talk about the thematic apperception test, which is actually over here. We'll spend some time talking about that. And Freud would ask you to determine what you see in here and describe what the scene means. And oftentimes these are ambiguous and not really well defined. And lastly, we can talk about the draw a person tests, which are really unique in the sense that we find very big differences in what people draw about, especially for kids who, as the book says, maybe have some issues. But these are all ways that we can assess the unconscious through just asking and seeing what people see. What do you interpret out of these things? Beyond that, we talked a bit about the idea of free association. So how this actually works is that this can temporarily bypass the censoring mechanism employed by the ego. So you can almost think about this like saying something before you think, right? So hopefully this exposes strange or uncensored ideas. So if I flash, the words on the page here one at a time to you, and I say flashlight, and you say light, and I say hand, and you say, let's say we're a very angry person. Say we're very violent, and we see this, and we say flashlight, and we say weapon. I say hand, I say strangle. Pine tree, I say hang. I didn't think up a good one for book yet, but book, reading, that's not a good one. But we might be able to find some interesting thoughts through that depending on what people see, especially if they're not giving themselves time to think. They're just doing what comes immediately to mind. And one issue is that this sometimes, Freud would claim, happens to us consciously when we're not trying to, in the idea of Freudian slips. And Freudian slips are a misstatement or slip of the tongue, right? So a Freudian slip is when you say one thing but mean your mother, is a great joke explaining a Freudian slip because he shouldn't have said mother. So his mom must be on his mind. Right? And so this may represent unconscious associations. But Freud also talked about hypnosis, and this is something I've got a lot of problems with as a person, but I'm not well versed in the research. Hypnosis and hypnotism allows the hypnotist to bypass the ego, right? So you're not talking to the conscious awareness anymore, and maybe you're focused on that ego, but not the conscious part of it. Now, the interesting thing is not everybody is responsive to hypnosis, only some people are. And there's a couple factors that make people more or less responsive, but if you're not somebody who's responsive to hypnosis, it's really not going to work on you. If you don't believe hypnosis is going to work, it's really not going to work on you. However, it does work on some people. Now, all of this is about what we would call symbolic behavior. Freud likes to talk about this, and he liked to talk about symbolic behavior, one, in terms of dreams, in terms of what we see, in terms of what we perceive, but also the daily symbols in our lives that might represent unconscious desires. And the book gives a great example about a patient of Freud whose mom loved daisies. It was her favorite flowers. And what he would do, though, is that he had a mat that was covered in daisies, a floor mat, and he would stomp on it every day before he came in. So Freud would say this is a symbolic behavior for his hatred for his mother. Now, these pose no threat to the ego because theoretically, I guess Freud would say you could mentally argue that the people aren't aware of these symbolic behaviors and that they're happening outside of their conscious awareness. But again, that's a question that we can't really test. That's a lot for the Freudian theory of personality. There's a lot to it, and I am aware of that. But let's talk about psychoanalysis, or a system of psychotherapy that focuses on uncovering these unconscious thoughts, this material that's responsible for this disorder. What are the underlying conditions that we're not seeing with conscious thought? The goal here is to bring our unconscious material into consciousness for rational examination, right? To open our minds up and look into them and see what our minds are hiding, what we're afraid of. But this unconscious material must be dealt with in a manner to avoid manifestation of new disorders. So if you stop repressing these terrible thoughts of sexual trauma that Freud claimed was so common for many of his patients, you don't want them to be thinking about it in their conscious life and causing more problems. That's not what we want to do. So in the same way, when you take something apart, you want to put it back together correctly. When you take apart a person's mind like this, you don't want to leave anything out. You want to make sure everything goes back into the place it does and that they're left a better person, because otherwise you could cause more issues for them. Now, with psychoanalysis, it requires several hour-long therapy sessions. This is the quintessential lay back in a chaise lounge and let the person behind you ask you questions while you respond. It's expensive. Even back in the day, right? These were the first types of therapy. This was not a common thing. And now it's not exactly a common thing as well. And let's be honest, most insurances aren't exactly the best. However, some insurances do cover different types of therapy, but not always psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. A lot of time here, though, is spent just trying to get at this material, because Freud claims there were so many defense mechanisms and issues getting down to this material. It took a lot of time. And not only that, it took a lot of trust in your therapist. You can't go in here expecting to not, or let me rephrase that. You really need to, as a patient of psychotherapy, trust in your therapist. And the therapists are considered neutral experts on the subject. So a psychoanalyst is going to be actively interpreting what you say, what you're thinking, how you're acting, based on all of these principles we've talked about and others. And what sometimes happens though is a development of resistance occurs. So the client either thinks they're slowing down or gets upset at the therapist. And this is actually what Freud would say is a sign of progress, that we are making effort in the same vein of you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. Now, with psychoanalysis, there was this issue that Freud talked about of transference. And transference is displacing any of our emotions that we might have from other people onto the therapist. So imagine I hate my dad, and I really just am so mad at him for all the things he did. What I might do, especially if I have a male therapist, is I might transfer some of those feelings onto this person and say, well, I don't like him. He's just like my dad, or maybe I don't even consciously know that. Freud claimed this was a delicate and crucial part of therapy. And he described an important portion of this being that, maybe this allows people to walk through their problems in a way that's more healthy. If I can't make peace with my dad, in this example, maybe I can through talking to somebody who is standing in for my dad at this point. Now, a big thing to recognize is that you must avoid countertransference. Right? You must not put that information or that kind of feelings back onto the patient. So you need to be careful as a therapist that you're not mixing other clients or your own personal life into that and causing you to see that person in a different way. What's really interesting and really upsetting to me is that studies do indicate that psychoanalytic therapies are effective in treating several psychological disorders. You can see some of the use in depression, anxiety, other psychosomatic disorders, so similar to Anna O, things like phobias, and even OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder, all have been shown to benefit at least somewhat from psychotherapy. So psychoanalysis is a thing. Yeah, it is. But it also has some projective tests that we can use. And we've talked about some of these already, right? Rorschach's ink blot test, where we can predict behavior from the responses to ink blots. So this was designed by Herman Rorschach, and these were just ink blots that were folded crossways and then presented to the patient, and they just asked, what do you see? Beyond that, we can also talk about thematic apperception tests, which we said a little bit about earlier. So these test takers are asked to tell a story about a series of ambiguous pictures. So a picture like this, you'd be asked to come up with a story for it. This was designed by Henry Murray, who we talked about a bit on day one, and we'll continue to talk about later. We can also talk about the human figure drawing test, or the draw a person test. So what's interesting about this is it measures intelligence and other important personality constructs, of which we're not going to go into for time. It's used as an indicator of if there are any problems with kids. Right, we have 3 different pictures down here of how kids have drawn a person, whether that be themselves or not. What Freud called, or people in this book decided to call, emotionally disturbed children draw different kinds of pictures, which is interesting. Right? Here it looks like the adult or some kind of person is killing another one and maybe about to kill somebody else, or right, is getting hit. It's very strange. You might also ask if this child was maybe sexually assaulted, because what is this and why is that there? Anyways, some criticisms of generally projective tests. It says Rorschach, but generally is that there's not really good reliability, and it's frequently not good in terms of validity either. There's no scientific basis for why this should be used, right? It's just some random thing. Reviewers do find that it is useful when we look at what we might call a meta-analysis and a lot of different studies combined. We do find some usefulness for this. And newer systems for coding this have been found to be useful. But projective tests extend beyond psychotherapy. It's not just that. This can help us evaluate social and emotional adjustment, right? Seeing how you respond to these things might be useful. Psychologists working with law enforcement and court officials have found use with these. That kind of scares me, to be very honest with you. But the validity of these remains open to challenge. So let's end by talking about some strengths and criticisms of Freud's theory. Well, first off, let's talk about a couple strengths. Well, that's weird. These shouldn't have all come up at once. Oh well. So one of the strengths is that this is the first really comprehensive theory of personality, and how we work. Doesn't mean it's a good one, but it's the first one. Freud's observations did set the direction for how we pretty much think about psychology today. Right? Those first kind of impressions and understandings about that have carried through the times. We see this even in things like modern culture, which still thinks of psychologists as just psychoanalysis. But it's also important to know that this was really the first system of treating the mind, of psychotherapy. That these were very useful tools, and still are for many therapists. And the way we can talk about them and use them with people has changed slightly, but it is not entirely different. Finally, we talk about these really important psychological concepts, right? Freud was hugely important in understanding the unconscious. We know there is unconscious material going on in our brain, or unconscious thoughts that are going on in our brains all the time. And Freud really helped to catapult this into the understanding of generally lay people, psychologists, everyone. Now, he also catapulted a lot of other things to stardom, and maybe they're not so great. So with that, what are some criticisms of Freud's theory? Well, some of the writers argue that it's not original, that Freudian ideas appear in literature that predates his work. Brewer actually accused him of stealing some of his information in his own theory for his own doing. Now, we can also talk about, as we mentioned before, these aren't falsifiable. We can't test these hypotheses. And beyond that, disagreements with the points of emphasis and tones of Freud's theory are huge and valid. Why do we spend so much time talking about psychosexual development and nothing about adult development? Why is it the case that apparently all we are driven by is the urge for sex and the urge for violence? These are very important questions that are wrapped up in Freud's theory, but they're not exactly wholly dependent on that. And so, we can't ever tell if there is an id, and we can't tell if there is an ego. We can talk about the ways in which we work, and sometimes in the same way that Inside Out used little characters to describe emotions, the concept of an id, ego, and superego is useful. It doesn't mean we can prove it, it doesn't mean we can tell it, it doesn't mean they're true, but they are one way we can look at this. So with that in mind, keep up with the materials. Stop by office hours if you have any questions. Otherwise, looking forward to seeing you guys in class. Oh yeah, make sure you do the quiz before class instead of after the class. Thanks. If you need anything, please let me know. Otherwise, have a great evening, day, whatever time you guys do this, 3 in the morning. Have a good one.